Good evening. I'm Seth Pinsky, CEO of the 92nd Street Y, New York. I'm delighted to welcome you to this talk about a very significant topic, innovation in cancer research and care. Before we begin, I'd like to thank the Mount Sinai Health System for sponsoring this evening's program. I have no doubt tonight's discussion will be enlightening and inspiring as we explore what new potential cures are on the horizon and why it's crucial to include diverse populations in the development of treatments. Now, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Ramon Parsons, Director of the Tisch Cancer Institute at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai and Ward Coleman Chair in Cancer Research. He's also Chair of Oncological Sciences, as well as Director of the Tisch Cancer Center. I'd also like to welcome Dr. Cardinal Smith, who's a professor at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in the departments of Hematology and Medical Oncology, along with Geriatrics and Palliative Medicine. She also serves as Chief Medical Officer for Tisch Cancer Hospital at the Mount Sinai Hospital, as well as Chief Quality Officer for Cancer Services on behalf of the Mount Sinai Health System. And moderating tonight's important conversation is USA Today's health reporter Karen Weintraub. Thank you for joining us this evening. I hope you enjoy tonight's event. And now, I'll turn it over to Karen.
Hi, and welcome to Confronting Cancer, what advances are being made in research and care. My name is Karen Weintraub, and I'll be your moderator today. I'm a health reporter at USA Today. And I guess we should start first by introducing the other panelists. Dr. Parsons, why don't you go first?
Yeah, hi. My name is Ramon Parsons. I'm the director of the Tisch Cancer Institute and the Mount Sinai Tisch Cancer Center. I'm also the chair of the Department of Oncological Sciences, and my background is in cancer research.
Happy to be with you here today. My name is Cardinal Smith. I am the Chief Medical Officer for the Tisch Cancer Hospital and Associate Director for Community Outreach and Engagement for the Tisch Cancer Institute here at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. And I'm a health services and health disparities researcher interested in improving the quality of care for patients with cancer and specifically improving equity of care for structurally marginalized populations.
Great, thank you both so much. So we want to have a very wide-ranging discussion today, but let's start with current events. So we know we're 51 years past the start of the war on cancer, and President Biden is putting renewed emphasis on ending cancer as we know it. So what does that mean, and how realistic is it? What do you think? How do you think cancer treatment will look different in 5 years or 10 years? Dr. Parsons?
Yeah, thank you for that question, Karen. The way I sort of see it is we've been on this long journey, this over 50-year journey, to try to understand the disease better so that we have better ways to treat it. Back in the early 1970s, when the war on cancer was started, we knew very little about the disease at all, really. We knew that some viruses could cause cancer, and we had this idea that maybe genes in these viruses were the culprit for the disease. But it wasn't really until the later in the 1970s that it became clear that that genes are not only causing the disease when viruses cause cancer, but that later in the 1980s that actually genes in our own bodies can be mutated to cause cancer. To sort of simply put it, our early efforts were all focused on the cells that became cancer cells, despite the fact when you look at a cancer under the microscope, you can clearly see that the cancer cells are not all there all alone. They're blood vessels that are feeding it. There are stromal fibroblasts that are helping the tumor grow. And also there are immune cells. Some of these immune cells, now we know this in hindsight, are not there just to protect the body from the cancer, but some of them actually are sort of helping facilitate the tumor to grow. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that as time has gone on, we have a much more sophisticated understanding of what's going on in the cancer and that the roles these different non-cancer cells are playing. We call this the tumor microenvironment, the different constituents that are in the tumor beyond the tumor cell. And so this understanding of the biology of the disease and its linking to genes that are altered in the cancer cell and how the cancer cell is kind of reprogramming this tumor microenvironment is really something that's really pushing the envelope and understanding how do we not only understand the disease but also treat the disease. Gives us new approaches to treating the disease that we didn't have before. I mean, sort of, I guess to put it in a nutshell, cancer affects hundreds of thousands of people every year. We're seeing with this 50-year effort that better outcomes for many different cancer patients, and this effort has come from, sort of this improved outcome has come from all this effort. So we basically, I think, are on a trajectory to finish answering your question. We're on a trajectory to sort of really change the disease and how not only we understand it, but how we treat it. And, obviously there's more and more people in this country, right? So it's really, we study the rate of cancer per 100,000 population, but we feel that those rates are going to be coming down, not only because of better treatment, but also more informed prevention. I didn't talk about prevention yet, but prevention has come a long way over the years. We've developed very useful preventive approaches, probably foremost among them reducing smoking, but also many other preventions that we could talk about later, but basically are really also moving the needle in addition to improving our treatments.
Right. And Dr. Smith, can you talk a little bit about for whom is that needle not moving, or I understand that it's not equitably distributed, those advances. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So, I think that there are multiple different types of populations in whom cancer care is not distributed as equally. And I guess the way that I like to think about that is that it's really structured more along the social determinants of health. I think we've talked about that a lot of late when we think about the pandemic and how COVID-19 has really brought to bear that there are particular populations, and that may be true that these are populations of color or people who tend to have lower socioeconomic status. But, in general, these populations are populations who, these social determinants, these are things like food security, housing security, the ability to be able to access healthcare, to be able to access digital literacy, educational access and attainment, these kinds of determinants, these things that help us get the kind of care we need, whether there be healthcare or otherwise, are things that really disadvantage certain types of populations. And so really, those are the things that impact the way in which people are able to receive good care. And so to put that into some perspective, when I think about the patients that I see, I'm clinically, I treat patients with lung cancer. And I also am a palliative care clinician. And so when I think about my patients, when I have patients who are coming in to see me and they're not able to pay their light bill, for example, and I wonder why they are struggling to be able to keep their appointments with me. Well, if they can't charge their phone, then they're not getting the reminders about their appointments, and therefore they're not coming in when they're supposed to, right? These are the kinds of struggles and challenges that patients face that minimize their ability to receive good quality care in the way in which we would want them to receive care. And those are real challenges. And if you would allow me to expand a little bit on what Dr. Parsons was talking about sort of these changes and advancements in the last 50 years, Just to put sort of an application on it, I like to consider myself as still being young, although my children would probably think very differently. But, I finished my training in 2010. And so when I was a fellow, for lung cancer, we had 2 drugs that we used to treat lung cancer. That was it, the same 2 drugs, that was all we used. And now we think of lung cancer as really like 4 or 5 different types of cancer, because that's the way treatment has evolved. Now we test for different types of changes in the cancer itself that we can target to be able to more specifically treat those different types of cancers. And so that has definitely made a big impact to what we've seen and what Dr. Parsons has mentioned in terms of the changes and how much longer people are now living with cancer.
Right. And are those benefits, is everybody across the country getting access to those same drugs, or do you see some discrepancies there?
Yeah, and we do see discrepancies. I think, unfortunately, when we have novel, more innovative types of technology, both in terms of how we test for cancer and how we treat cancer, there are populations who unfortunately are left out. And, part of what contributes to that is that patients receive their care in different settings, right? And so we tend to think of what we consider more academic places, like places like Mount Sinai, where we are connected to medical schools or higher institutions of learning, where we are a National Cancer Institute designated center. These places that are considered to be connected to clinical trials, for example, to be places where we are doing more novel, frontline, cutting edge type of cancer care delivery. But unfortunately, the majority of patients in this country do not receive their cancer care at these types of institutions because they don't have access to them, right? Many patients live in rural areas where being able to access an institution like this would require them to travel for several hours. And that's just not feasible. Or they're not able to afford being able to get to those kinds of institutions. And those oncologists who then therefore practice in some of these more, rural environments or some of these more community settings, they have to take care of many different types of cancers. And, I just shared that lung cancer now feels like 5 different types of cancers. To be honest, it's hard for me, right, to manage the one cancer type that I have to be able to be responsible for. It is incredibly challenging to be in an environment where you have to manage multiple cancer types and be on top of all of that. And so then being able to access all of the new innovation and the testing that's available for that to stay on the front lines of what's available is even more challenging. And so we know that patients, again, going back to the social determinant health issue, but we know that these patients tend not have access to those types of tests, so that they don't get them, and then they therefore don't get access to the types of treatments that those tests are testing for.
Right. Dr. Parsons, could you talk a little bit about those tests and what we're learning and how we're understanding cancer differently through those tests?
Well, I guess the best answer to that question is this is something that's not static. I guess to go back over the 50-year trajectory, it wasn't long ago. I remember when the first mutations were discovered in cancer when I was a graduate student. And these have become sort of standard testing now for figuring out which kind of treatment to give a patient. When we're talking, it's probably important for this audience to understand the differences between mutations that occur in the tumor specifically versus mutations that we inherit. I think in the lay public, I think most folks are familiar with inherited mutations that have a risk for cancer predisposition. Something like the BRCA1 mutation and a risk factor for breast cancer. Now, these are very important, but often when we're trying to design therapy for patients, we're testing the tumor, because tumors accumulate mutations specifically within the tumor that can be used for therapy. I think Dr. Smith, in referencing her work with lung cancer patients in the treatment of this class of cancer, for instance, the EGFR mutation that is very common in lung cancer, a subset of lung cancers get this mutation. We have a drug that can effectively inhibit the EGFR protein, which is activated by the mutation and leads to a therapeutic benefit. Now, we need to know up front who has that mutation in order to be able to effectively treat that person. This is also true for many other kinds of cancer where we have other similar genes that are driving the tumor to grow. And we by sequencing, DNA sequencing the tumor, we can find out, aha, there is an EGFR mutation. There is a BRAF mutation, et cetera. These are just names of genes. And that there are pharmaceutical companies have developed drugs that can attack these. So this is, I would say, depending on the type of cancer, we have different molecular diagnostic genetic tests that help us, I guess, subdivide or classify the different kinds of patients within that group and allow us to manage treatment more effectively. That said, we often still have genes that are mutated in cancer that we don't have drugs for yet. But that number is dwindling. As time has passed over the last 10 to 15 years, we're seeing more and more drugs that really can capture more and more of these different targets. Now, sorry to just wax poetic here, but the thing that I would just add is often single treatment is not effective. It depends. Single arm treatment, I mean, it actually works kind of well in lung cancer, but in other kinds of cancer, for instance, GI cancer, the same mutation that might be targetable in lung cancer may not be as easily treated in colon cancer. And these are likely biologic and reasons and biochemical reasons that are wired into the different cell types. And so we have to really understand not only the genetic changes as we do this testing and what their consequences in terms of identifying a gene that's altered and then using that information to figure out a targeted therapy, but then in the context of the person's specific disease is very important. And even within a single disease, the stage at which the disease is treated often does have an impact on the patient's outcome.
Right. Can we switch now to thinking about immune therapy, which is another extremely promising area, especially I think in some types of lung cancer? Maybe both of you could speak about the impact that you're seeing of immunotherapy on treatment.
Cardi, you want to go first? I mean, Dr. Smith, do you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah, I think, clinically for us, immunotherapy certainly has been one of the newer therapies, particularly among people who have a history of smoking, that has really helped prolong survival. I think that for non-smokers, people who have a mutation that Dr. Parsons was talking about, we know that there are targeted medications that have really made an impact in terms of life prolongation, but we hadn't seen that same thing in the population who have developed lung cancer as a result of smoking that has contributed to cancer. And that had really changed with the advent of immunotherapy. I think challenges remain for us in lung cancer when it comes to immunotherapy. In particular, we know that there are definitely long-term responders to immunotherapy. And by long-term responders, I mean people who have had immunotherapy for several years and are able to go off of immunotherapy and not have any evidence of disease for years and continuing to live well. And yet we don't yet know how to predict who those folks are going to be, right? And so that's really the next frontier is how are we able to determine who are going to be those people who are able to respond to immunotherapy and have long-term response? And then how do we predict those who might not have a long-term response, and how do we overcome some of the resistance that develops to the immunotherapy? And I think that's really now the next step that's coming.
So my my take on immunotherapy is that we really have learned a lot in the last decade about this aspect of the tumor. 20 years ago, I think it's fair to say, or even 15 years ago, it's fair to say that there were two camps. There were sort of, I would say, not political parties, but two, I would say, advocacy groups. One focused on the mutations that were occurring on the tumor and trying to figure out how to attack those mutations using small molecule drugs. And then the other being, I would say, more of a fringe group, being the cancer immunologists, who had lots of beautiful supporting data showing that the immune system was being misregulated in tumors, and that there were certain experimental systems where you could actually benefit a laboratory animal with an immunotherapy. But these were really research questions that hadn't been established in a meaningful way that it was actually effective to try these approaches in patients. And it really started out in melanoma, was the first area where the immune checkpoint therapy was first shown to be really effective for patients with advanced melanoma. And I think one of the things I think that this audience would benefit from understanding is how quickly that information was transmitted. Is soon within like the space of a year, on a dime, the whole field started to respect the whole approach of immunotherapy. And although I'm sure there's always going to be sort of folks that are not easily steered or guided towards useful information, I think one of the nice things about physicians and treatment folks is we're problem oriented, we're problem solving oriented. So if we see something that's going to help our patients, we really want to make sure that we do something about it. So anyway, so I think just to sort of sum up my point is that this came out like a rocket around 2012, 13, 14, over that period of time when we first learned about this and started trying to apply it to other diseases and in combination with other therapies. And that experiment is still going on. And as Dr. Smith mentioned, one of the things that we recognize now is for some reason, some patients never respond to immunotherapy and others become resistant to it. And that's a very important biology that we need to figure out in order for us to come up with a better response, A, to treat it up front, or B, to avoid relapses when it's actually working. And there are a lot of mysteries, unfortunately, left in this disease that need to be solved. And that's some of the research that we're doing that we're most excited about, is trying to figure out how these switches in the immune system are being regulated, because it's not just one switch, there's several of them, and we're trying to figure out what they are and then ways to regulate them therapeutically.
And as you say, they're different across different cancers also, and some are more amenable to treatment than others.
I think, yes, for sure. Each cancer type, as Dr. Smith mentioned, is different. And then within, as we've learned more and more about cancers by doing what we call molecular profiling, we've learned that each kind of cancer has multiple subtypes of cancer. And actually, you could even argue that each person is unique and needs really individualized treatment. This is a problem, right? Because when we do that, we don't have a frame of reference. If everyone's unique, then who do we use to learn from, right? So we try to structure the sort of the most discrete identifiable groups and see how they behave as a group. And we tend to see signals where we see benefit within a defined subgroup based on a medicine. And this is the kind of thing we're constantly doing. It's the interplay between the diagnostic understanding of the disease and the more sophisticated subtyping of it, and the new treatments that we're developing to try to help our patients.
Right. And then backing up another step, can we talk a little bit about screening and how do we identify patients early enough so that we can do something effective for them? Lung cancer screening, I think, is a good example because it's proven to be effective in a certain population, and yet most people are not using it even in that population.
You know, the uptake of lung cancer screening has definitely been slow. And I think similar to what we've seen with screening in other cancer types, we see similar disparities with certain populations, which is, I think, particularly more pronounced because we know, lung cancer is a cancer that is predominantly caused by smoking. And when we look at those although smoking has decreased significantly, we know that there are certain populations that still continues to smoke more than others, and that tends to be more Black men tend to smoke more than other populations now, and that's a population that is not being screened as well, right? And so when we think about lung cancer screening having a big impact on being able to not only diagnose lung cancer earlier, but also being able to improve mortality, because lung cancer historically is a cancer that is diagnosed at more late stage disease when cure is not a possibility. That has even larger implications. And so, I think there's a lot of organizations. We're working with several of them here to be able to really target specific communities where we know there's large smoking rates, large populations of people in whom we can be targeting to try and increase screening. I think that there certainly are, there's misinformation out there about, right, what lung cancer screening is and what it isn't. And I think, as we saw in the pandemic, right, there's the trust is an issue. Right, and connection with healthcare systems is a concern. And I think a lot of the work that we have been doing here as part of, community outreach and engagement is really connecting with the community to understand, what their needs are, sort of how they prefer to partner with us as a healthcare system, and how they want to hear that information. So that as we are working with them, we're doing it in a way that is responsive, culturally responsive, to cater to their needs, but that we're also being able to provide those resources and connecting to the healthcare that they need, because that certainly is the sort of the next area where we have to focus, right? We've been able to increase mammography for women for breast cancer. We've been able to improve colorectal cancer screening across men and women. And now we need to be able to do the same thing for lung cancer screening.
What about liquid biopsies for you, Dr. Parsons? Sort of where is the potential there for finding cancers we didn't know about or couldn't have predicted?
Absolutely, Karen. I'm just going to, before I answer that question, I'm going to also just talk about screening in general and just say that one of the wonderful things about living in New York is we have this beautiful city with 5 boroughs, and we've got patients in many different basically pretty much any ethnicity, any socioeconomic tier you want. It's extremely diverse city, and based on Dr. Smith's and others' analysis of New York City, of the data on our mortality data for cancer across all the different disease types, we recognized that prostate cancer mortality was really quite high in certain neighborhoods, and also tracked with the Black male population. As part of a response to this, we were really, the Department of Urology here with the Tisch Cancer Institute at Mount Sinai, were able to work with Robert Smith, a very generous donor, to help purchase a screening van for prostate cancer. And this screening van has been going to these specific neighborhoods that are at the highest risk, and collecting blood samples to measure PSA, and also referring these gentlemen to appropriate follow-up care. And I do think that when we see these really quite different rates of cancer frequency, late-stage diagnosis, and mortality, it's a real red flag that we're not doing enough as a society to take care of these different people. And the one thing, though, that we absolutely need is this information, because if we don't know there's a problem, we can't fix it. And certainly, this is an example, I think, where this kind of concerted action, and as Dr. Smith mentioned, in a culturally appropriate way, where it's something where it's recognized as needed, right? And so that there's community receptiveness to this, is going to, I think, hopefully have a real long-term impact for this disease. Because for certain types of cancer, the discrepancies are much, much less. But some are worse, and prostate's one that we're hoping will be able to really correct with this type of approach. Anyway, liquid biopsy. So you asked about liquid biopsy. This is, I would say, one of those places that we're all super excited about. The ability to potentially take a simple blood sample that's taken at a regular doctor's visit after you reach certain age, perhaps when cancer starts to become more common, or some other cutoff, in order to reduce the false positives, because we don't want false positives. The hope is that that this will be a routine screening test that could allow for us to really catch something that we wouldn't have otherwise caught through normal modalities. The other way of looking at it is there are high-risk individuals that are high risk for getting lung cancer, high risk for liver cancer, high risk for breast cancer, et cetera. And then being able to monitor those individuals with a liquid biopsy, probably always in combination with either mammography or CT scanning, or whatever the imaging modality is, because I think it's probably going to be a complex solution. But ultimately, this idea of being able to catch these cancers early, right, before they're recognizable, is going to ultimately, I think, definitely move the needle and improve survival, particularly in diseases where screening isn't that effective, like ovarian cancer, pancreatic cancer, brain cancer, et cetera. These would be a great benefit.
Right. And right now, they're not quite ready for prime time yet, right?
No,
you
they're
already
not.
have cancer, but not.
Yeah, I think they work right now if you already have cancer and you want to track the disease to see your progress and response to therapy. Now, that's not available for every kind of cancer necessarily, but I think generally this is available. Where it's not really been proven to be effective is the upfront screening approach. There are, companies out there that are offering this, but it's still early days, and I think it requires more evidence. Also, I hate to say this, but also these tests are not cheap. And, if, depending on how do we pay for it, it may be just too expensive to screen if the screening test itself is just too expensive. And if it only captures a small number of patients, I mean, there has to be some easily identifiable benefit from these tests. But that's hopefully prices we know will be coming down going forward, because these are all based on DNA sequencing of some method or another. And ultimately that we've been noticing consistent price reductions as time has passed. So that should hopefully be something that will solve itself through the improvement of the technology.
But it's too early now for people to be shelling out that money themselves or asking for it.
I think right now, I mean, Dr. Smith I'm sure will want to comment on this, but I would say that at this point, I'd like to see more evidence about exactly what the benefit is for the patient, because obviously, and we've seen this with other screening modalities as they've rolled out. If you have too many false positives, that has its own harm in itself, right? And that not only causes patient angst, potentially unnecessary angst, but also procedures to figure out what the cause of the disease is that could, really be counterproductive. And so I think though that we'll see in the next 5 years or so some clarity about which people we would think that we're screening would be a benefit. As I mentioned early on, age is a risk factor for cancer. And so at a certain age, maybe it makes sense to start screening for this, for different kinds of cancer. And also if you have like a risk factor, like, a BRCA mutation or a Lynch syndrome mutation, that also makes sense as something. But we're still, at least I haven't seen the strong evidence yet to say, okay, we need to start screening with this method based on X, Y, and Z at this point yet. But it's very promising. I would hope. Anyway, I'm sure Dr. Smith has her take on this.
I agree completely with what Dr. Parsons says. I think it is still very much early days. And at this point, I wouldn't necessarily even know what to do with the information, and what tests to do. And because that's the question is, how far do you go, right? How far do you go to look for something? When do you stop? Right. Right. And when do you feel comfortable enough to know that you can stop? And I think that's really the information that we don't yet know. We just don't have enough information yet. And so I think in the clinical trial setting, right, while we're studying it and understanding what it means, then that, yes, totally fine. But as a standard of care, not yet. And that I also think to that point, because we often know, to your points from earlier questions, that there are populations that tend to get left out of this. It is a really great opportunity while we are studying this to understand, right? Like, what are the ways in which we can engage populations who tend to be more marginalized and really aren't included always with these innovative types of tests, and populations who may not have access for all the social determinant of health reasons we talked about, but in whom, there are trust issues around what this means, or there may be health literacy issues, right? As a clinician, it's hard enough for me to understand what to do when I get the information. How do you have a shared decision-making conversation with a patient about having this test, ordering it, what it means, and then all of the things we need to do depending on what the results show us, right? And so how do you start working and engaging in those conversations now to know how we can deliver that to all folks, regardless of their language or their literacy early on, I think is really important, and what we would need to be doing now so that we can make sure it's equitable when it's ready for prime time.
Yeah, I mean, that brings up a good point about communication, that a lot of patients really don't even understand the treatment they're getting or what they could be getting otherwise.
That's right. That's absolutely right. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a real challenge for some people. What do you think in terms of the country? Are we putting enough resources to cancer? Obviously, you guys would always want more. But do you think that the priorities are right now? Or do we need to shift our focus as a society?
Well, that's a really, Karen, that's a really tough question to answer. Yeah, I will say that there is a huge investment by the federal government and by industry and philanthropy in cancer. I think that's justified. It's a leading cause of death here around the world and in the United States and in New York. And I think one of the issues about cancer that is so hard to understand for the lay audience and even for me is how complex it is. I mean, back to every person's cancer is unique. This is really actually true. And so when you have this level of complexity, you have to study each of the different subtypes to understand how to better treat them, understand how to prevent them. And this requires specialization and expertise. So as a result of that, you have all these different specialized efforts going on in the prevention areas, the public health areas, and the behavioral areas, in the research, basic research areas, and the clinical treatment areas that are going on in parallel all the time at our cancer center and throughout the country. And so this kind of academic exercise, which is sort of like divide and conquer, does create silos, right? So as you're trying to get better and better at what you do, you become kind of blindered and you start to not see the big picture. And this is something that can be a barrier to progress, and we have to keep an eye on this constantly and really vigilant as we try to go forward. But I guess I would just say that overall, as we try to take a hack at this disease and really try to make an impact, we're putting a huge amount of effort into it, both financial and human resources. All sorts of scientists and physician scientists are doing from their various perspectives. And I do sometimes think that you can like pound your head against the wall and not make any progress if you don't have the right idea. So one of the things I can tell you is that we get benefit not just from working on cancer and the investment in cancer per se, we also get it from getting information from other fields that lead us to new ideas, whether they be from physicists or chemists or
Immunologists,
geneticists, or all. And so we benefit from all the progress that's made. And then I guess the other one would be just technology development. When I first started as a graduate student doing my MD PhD, I literally had to sequence the samples myself. I would make a mix of a cocktail of and sequence them by hand and then look at the radioactive trace. Now it's like super automated and like literally a millionfold more efficient. It's kind of like the trajectory that we've seen with computational power, is DNA sequencing power. But I don't know, I'm a little lost in my train of thought. But basically, to say that our effort, the technology development is always something that has to go hand in hand with advances in cancer, whether it be from the diagnostic point of view or the treatment point of view. The development of monoclonal antibodies, the development of small molecule inhibitors that target kinases. These were all advances in pharmacology. There's lots of things I can't even tell you about, but we are dependent on not just studying the disease, we're dependent on connecting the dots and making sure that we have scientists that are doing that professionally so that they can take advantage of all the information that we have already and also create new information that didn't exist before.
Dr. Smith, it seems like you're interdisciplinary just in yourself with lung cancer and palliative care and disparity issues. Can you maybe talk about that kind of crosstalk that happens or should happen?
Yeah, I think it definitely should happen. And you know, when you were talking about funding, I was chuckling internally because I think I do think there's been a lot of great effort put on the science of cancer and the basic science of cancer. And I think of late, there's been a lot more recognition that there are, you know, there's the sort of what we call the bedside to community part of the research that we do. And there's been a lot more money invested in that part of the research enterprise, which has been great. And I think that there's even more that we can do when we think about that team science approach, and really, you know, how do we support those researchers who are, you know, sort of that bedside to community, working hand in hand with those who are at the bench, you know, who are doing that basic science research, so that as they are thinking about the work that they're doing, they can be thinking about how does that then translate to the person that how do I think about that person and how that work that I'm doing relates to them, right? So that we're thinking about it throughout the continuum. I also think that, you know, there's a lot more effort that we need to be able to put into. We come up with lots of wonderful therapies, but they have an impact on patients, right? We're helping people live longer, and what are they living longer with? What are the side effects of the treatments that they're living with? What are the side effects of the cancer itself that they're living with, right? You know, there are real consequences of cancer. How do we support patients through that journey, right? There's financial toxicity associated with cancer, right? How are we helping them to both understand that, manage it, and deal with it? When you talk about resources, right? You know, in a 20-minute visit, I am to assess my patient's emotional health, their physical health, their caregivers' emotional health, physical health, right? And somehow get them up into their treatment, you know, like and they come into that visit with all of the other things, right? Their food insecurity, housing insecurity. And healthcare systems aren't resourced to manage any of that, right? I can't give, I don't have the ability to give them food if they're lacking. So, you know, I think that as a whole, we have to reimagine how we are able to support a lot of that. And that, you know, I think a lot of the work that we do is really partnering with our community organizations, right? Who are those community-based organizations that are focused on helping support folks with housing, helping support them with food security. How do we work with them to support our patients to get them through cancer care? But, you know, from a financial resource perspective, right, from a policy perspective, how can we support health systems more to be able to do that work and engage in that work? You know, I think if we use navigation as an example, you know, navigation is something that has been shown in the evidence over and over and over again to help patients through screening. It decreases disparities. I mean, Harold Freeman, who started this in Harlem decades ago, shown that he was able to get minority populations through screening successfully, decrease disparities. We're able to do that for patients through treatment, improve their outcomes, and yet navigation, there is no code for me to get reimbursed for navigation.
And you mean somebody to like shepherd them through and hold their hand and give them advice, that sort of thing? That's
exactly, someone to help coordinate their cancer care. Right? To help get them from their appointments, help them, as you said, sort of translate that communication, right? All of that gobbledygook medical speak, that jargon I just said as a clinician, right? Like, how do I translate that into the patient in lay language, right? What does that mean for you when you walk away from my visit? What did I just tell you to do? How does that translate into your everyday work, right? And everyday life? And yet there's no way for me to be able to support that from a resource perspective. No one reimburses for that work. And so it's left to healthcare systems to figure that out. And so, I think these are some of the places where if we were thinking about how do we reimagine care, how do we reimagine cancer care delivery, where do we put more resources? Those are the places where I would be thinking about it, because that's where we know we have the impact to really improve care sort of at the point of delivery.
Right.
It's going to make the most impact for patients and their loved ones.
Right.
Can I just
Please.
add one thing, Karen? So,
Please.
where are there gaps in funding? I think one place I think that would be useful to point out is that as an enterprise, cancer centers, which have all these different specialists doing a lot of different research, from clinical trials to basic research on diseases, this effort leads to new insight into the disease that we want to translate into new treatments and new types of prevention. And to get that actually up and running based on our own ideas internally is often a very, very high bar. We need, for instance, GMP manufactured, or sorry, I think GMP is like, we need to make
Good
a
manufacturing
medicine.
practices.
We need to make new medicines potentially, right? And to do that in-house, it's not typical. Typically, pharmaceutical companies do that. So if one needs to convince a pharmaceutical partner to make a new drug, it can be difficult, or one needs to start a new company. So often really good ideas get sort of sidetracked or delayed because of trying to get them ready to actually test in people. And this is, I think, a problem that we have, because often companies can be kind of resistant to new ideas, or they can really decide on something based on the market share or something that's kind of unique. Now, FDA is open to improving sort of time to approval of new drugs for rare diseases, but still, all in all, there is sort of the economic equation that companies really bring to the table. I think in the areas like drug repurposing, where we could take a drug that we now use for, let's say, rheumatoid arthritis and try it in cancer. Often, the companies are not interested. This is a rheumatoid arthritis disease, not a drug. It's not a cancer drug, so they can be resistant even there too. So it would be, I think, helpful if there were more resources put aside by the government to have clinician investigators develop their own investigator-initiated clinical trials based on their ideas that could be tested in the clinic for efficacy, particularly for some of these rare diseases that are not really on the front page or the top priority of various pharma companies. I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's called the Valley of Death, right? Between
Yeah, well, I didn't want to bring that
innovation
up. It sounds a little bleak, but yeah, you're right. It's considered the Valley of Death in the business, and for us as academicians, we sort of see it as like, we've been working on these ideas. We think some of them are terrific, but they really often, they can be somewhat stymied by lack of uptake if pharmaceutical companies are not interested. If there's a downturn in the market and new startups, like has happened in the last few years, have been reduced, all these things require investment, and so it would be an area, I think, to put more attention onto, in my opinion.
And drug repurposing, you just mentioned this idea of using drugs that have already been approved for some other purpose for cancer care. What do you see as the potential there, or the possibilities there?
Well, I'm super excited about this because we have such an armamentarium of drugs that affect many, many different parts of our bodies. And we have a lot of drugs in the space that are the immunology space. And since we now know so much more about the importance of the immune system, the ability to modulate it, right? I think there's a lot of untapped experiments out there that could be done that would be really important to test. I mean, some things are not going to work, right? But we won't know unless we try. And of course, we won't find something that works unless we try as well. So there's always trial and error with this. But I do think that getting some of these drugs or drug combinations that really aren't part of our normal thinking right now as a group would be of benefit to the community.
And that's where genomic medicine can help too, right? In figuring out, oh, this drug acts on that gene and we want to act on that gene. So maybe this drug will work, kind of thing.
Absolutely. I think with genomic medicine, those drugs often have to be designed for the genomic target. They're really often driven by mutations that occur in the tumor, and they are by sort of necessity. Often we're discovering new biochemistry, new biology in order to make new drugs that are effective and work. So I think the repurposing is not going to be really that useful there, because we don't have drugs in that space already. And so actually, this is an area I think there's enough investment in already, because there's incentive out there and also funding from the National Cancer Institute is targeting known cancer genes is a great area to be in, and because we know they're contributing to the disease and we have no way to treat them yet. But we know also by the track record for other cancer genes that these new cancer genes we don't have treatment for likely will eventually be treatable and druggable, so that the genomic medicine will just improve, I think, over time as we get more and more expertise and understanding.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Smith, you sort of alluded to it a little while ago, but if you had kind of the proverbial magic wand, what would you do? Would you, provide patient navigators for everybody? Is that your favorite, your preferred miracle, or what else would you say would be great?
So I don't know that I would do navigators for everyone, but what I would do is I would have a screening assessment of everyone. Really a social determinant of health screening assessment of everyone. And depending on how folks screen in, I think there would be a tiered approach, so that there would be some folks who, would likely not need any intervention. There would be some folks who would need lay health navigators, right? Just folks to orient them to cancer center, tell them where it is, sort of a contact in case they needed anything. And then there would be some people who would need either more nurse navigator, for sort of clinical needs as it related to physical symptoms, or folks who might need social work navigators, right? Depending on what those social determinant health needs, where they might need more social work specific needs. And I would of course have the resources to be able to provide that level of care for folks. Right. I think also with that, I would have my magic wand would be able to provide folks with, the financial counselors that they would need that would come along with that assessment, and really the mental health care that would be needed, because just like mental health is an issue outside of cancer, it isn't, it's an issue within cancer, that, we are resource constrained within cancer as well. And then, if I get my one last one would be, I'm needy, would be putting on my palliative care supportive oncology hat, would be, I don't think we're gonna have a workforce ever where there will be specialty palliative care that's available for every patient with cancer who needs it. And so I think being able to have a specialty palliative care workforce, similarly for those who need specialty palliative care, but really being able to provide the training and skills to the oncologists and the oncology clinicians, including our, advanced practice providers and nurses who are providing that primary oncology care, so that they can provide the necessary palliative care and symptom management to our patients.
And what do you think such palliative care could do for patients? How would that be a game changer?
Absolutely. So we know that palliative care, when combined with standard oncologic care, can improve patients' quality of life, improve their mood by decreasing depression. It also decreases, unnecessary utilization of acute care, like emergency room visits, hospitalizations, readmissions. And most importantly, it aligns care with patients' goals and values, so that patients get the kind of care they want for their cancer, which is really, I think, what we're all here for and what we want the most. And I think it does that by really enhancing communication and by providing expert symptom management.
Cool. And Dr. Parsons, if we hand you the magic wand, what's on your list?
Oh, well, I think having the ability to early detect cancer really early is something that we could save so many lives if we were able to have improved early detection. I also think that trying to understand how risk factors can be modulated, if we could have everybody stop smoking, right, we would really save a lot of lives. It also, diet and obesity are an important risk factor for cancer. That is something that is an epidemic in our country, and we really, we're kind of waiting for a surge in cancer cases due to the high fraction of our population that are overweight and obese. So my magic wand would be to get people to have a good, healthy diet, have their weight under control, and reduce their smoking. I think we would do so much good for the entire population. And then if I put my techie, geeky hat on, I would say that I do firmly believe that we know about a lot of the different genetic changes now that can cause cancer. However, we don't really know how to drug those. In many cases, we have a drug that kind of works, but it's not really perfect yet. So we need to iterate on that and improve that specific class of drugs. And then we have other targets where we don't have a drug at all. And we need to start with something small and then try to figure out how do we get to where we need to go in the next 10 to 20 years to improve that target. I think, to me, my background in field has been focused on tumor suppressors. And tumor suppressors are genes that are lost when the tumor develops. So it's hard to put the genie back in the bottle then. There's no tumor suppressor. And that was a helpful gene that helped prevent the cancer. If it's gone, it's hard to replace it, right? And so my biggest wish would be to come up with gene therapy approaches or other approaches that could replace tumor suppressors that are naturally part of our body's defense mechanism that are lost in the tumor. Why? You might ask, well, we know when we do that, in most instances or in many instances, we can actually, the tumor evolved to get rid of that tumor suppressor. So if we restore it, the tumor cell basically often dies. So it actually has a therapeutic benefit. And some of the most commonly mutated altered tumor suppressors are the most commonly mutated genes. And so we don't have drugs for them yet. So I would say, if I was going to put my super geek hat on, if we could figure out treatments to restore tumor suppressor function in our cancers, and pretty much every cancer has a tumor suppressor alteration of one form or another. So it would really help a lot of people too.
And where are we in pursuit of that?
That's an area where this is where technology is not ready yet. We have the COVID vaccine, which is a wonderful new treatment. It delivers a kind of a gene therapy, an RNA vaccine to your body, correct? And it's injected into your arm. However, it only needs to be taken up by a small number of cells to make antigens that can be recognized by the immune system. when we want to put a gene back into a cancer where you have literally billions of cells, how do we deliver that gene into those billions of cells? It's a problem that we haven't solved yet, but I do think with nanotechnology developments, there's efforts down that route. And I'm hopeful that we can get an approach like that. The other way to try, aside from a gene therapy approach, is to use pharmacological approaches that basically mimic, meaning small molecule approaches that mimic the tumor suppressor or the pathway the tumor suppressor is regulating. Or finally, it is possible that we could develop protein therapies where we actually, like antibodies are a protein, we could develop the tumor suppressor itself as a protein, could be somehow brought back into the body. And then because all of our normal cells are used to it, it's not toxic.
Right.
It's really only toxic, in my opinion, likely to be toxic to the tumor cell.
So we need to meet back here again in 10 years, 20 years, and hear you report back on that?
Yes, I think so.
Hopefully 10.
Yeah.
For my last question, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about this balance between fear and hope. Everybody in America and the world is afraid, lives a little bit with the fear of cancer. Certainly your patients do. How do you sort of balance that with the hope that a lot of this new research provides for the future? Dr. Smith?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question. I think if I just think about my own clinical experience, I shared that I treat patients mostly with lung cancer, and still, unfortunately, the majority of patients that I see are diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer, and and that is by definition still incurable. And yet I share with them the same thing I shared at the start of this call, which is that 12 years ago, when I was finishing my training, there were only 2 drugs for lung cancer, right? And now there are so many more. And I still have patients that I treated as a fellow who are alive today.
Wow.
And they're alive today because as I finished fellowship and training, there were new drugs that were undergoing clinical trials and investigation that they were able to participate in, and they worked, and they were able to benefit from that. And so I think fear, it's okay to be scared. It's real. That's normal. And that's a normal emotional reaction. And at the same time, we know that cancer care is getting better, that there's new discovery that's happening every day, and that we witness it and that we experience it. And so I think I share in the worry and the fear that my patients have. And yet I sit and I hope with them. And I think that's really all we can do.
Dr. Parsons, do you have?
Dr. Smith, I think, said it extremely well. I would just, I guess, echo the point that we're making progress every day in our research, both in the clinical research, the clinical trial research, and also in the laboratory. And this is leading to dividends and benefit. And that we have clinical trials often that are really poised to help a patient who, normal treatment isn't really an option anymore. And this gives a patient, I think, hope. These trials are designed so that they're going to try to help you, and based on the best knowledge that we have at the time. And often they work, right? So I do think that this kind of effort gives us hope in the aggregate and also for individuals. The fear part, cancer is not the same diagnosis it was when I was a kid. It really has changed. In our community, I'm sure we all know folks who've had a cancer diagnosis, whether it be family members or friends, and often the outcome is actually very good. So I don't think, even though we're not batting 1,000, there are so many good stories to tell that it's not what it was, back in the 1960s, for instance, or 70s, when the war on cancer started.
Right. Any final words from either of you? kind of things we didn't touch on or things you think are important to leave the audience with?
I would say just for me first, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you both today. I really enjoyed it. And I would say that it's been fun being here and also being able to see how cancer has changed and grown. And I think that there's still lots more to do. And I'm excited to see where the next 5, 10, 50 years will take us.
Great.
Well, I guess I would just want to close by saying also thank you very much, Karen. But I just thought it'd be good to give a little. I really like the way Dr. Smith sort of framed her fellowship training, like she saw in this relatively brief arc of time, no very limited treatment options for lung cancer, now to really quite sophisticated options, and made the disease started, like a whole field in its own, lung cancer, right? But I was thinking, it's going to be it's about almost 40 years that I've been doing cancer research. And as I mentioned earlier, I remember when the first cancer gene mutations were discovered in like colon cancer and other diseases back in the early 1980s. And one of the things that I kind of, reflect on is that over, my lifetime, in cancer research, we've seen like basically going from zero, like zero knowledge about what's actually happening from a genetic point of view of the disease to treatments that are genetically based, and really a blind kind of completely sort of all the tumors are the same approach to treatment, and now that's completely changed. So I just think that kind of perspective really gives me huge hope that the next 40 years is also going to be just as, if not more rapid in its advancement, at least just as rapid in its advancement. And I do think that we're going to be seeing certain diseases particularly really bite the dust because they've been so hard to figure out. But if we can figure them out once, meaning if we can figure out how to treat, let's say, pancreatic cancer better, right, it's going to really make a huge difference as we go forward, and it's going to pay dividends, for decades to come.
So thank you so much, Dr. Parsons and Dr. Smith. This was really great. Thank you also to the Tisch Cancer Institute at Mount Sinai Health System, the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, and of course the 92nd Street Y, New York.